Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. I get confirmation. Okay. Welcome to this webinar entitled Environmental Mobility and Solidarity. My name is Stijn Latré. I'm the director of UCSIA, the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, and I'm very happy that we can organize this webinar today. I hope you're all comfortable, also with the technical issues of this webinar. I guess most of you have some experience with Zoom already, since this is a Zoom webinar and not Zoom meetings. You will by default be muted and you cannot use your camera. In order to ask questions to the speakers for the Q&A part at the end of this webinar, you can post your questions in the Q&A function. You find it at the bottom of your screen. More informal messages you can post in the chat function. If you post questions in the Q&A, please mention to whom you ask your question. This will facilitate the task of the moderator. The moderator might unmute you manually to ask your question directly and maybe even start some kind of dialogue. I also remind you that this session will be or is being recorded. So you can watch it again on our UCSIA YouTube channel, or those who missed out this afternoon can of course watch it afterwards. Environmental mobility and solidarity. That is quite a challenging title. When we turn to the much quoted encyclical Laudato Si, we find that famous expression that appeals to our mind, our heart, and maybe foremost to our gut feeling, when Pope Francis urges us to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Indeed, once more in history, poorer people or countries seem to find themselves at the wrong side of the causal chain. While not having caused climate change, they suffer most from its effects. So we have here a huge issue of solidarity and responsibility. We see the face of the other, of the climate migrant or the local community suffering from climate change. This face of the other, in a way famously articulated by philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, this face of the other disturbs our concern with ourselves, our self-interest, and obliges us to respond. This ethical experience constitutes the foundation for systemic solidarity based on responsibility, on genuine concern with the fate of the other. And I am happy that we can reflect today on how solidarity with regard to climate change can take shape. I will now shortly give the floor to Peter Rožič, who will be our host for this webinar. Peter is director of JESC, the Jesuit European Social Center. Peter will introduce you to the excellent speakers we have here this afternoon. Peter, it's an honor to have you here. We have been working closely together for a few years now on the ELP program, and I'm happy to say that ELP fellow Lucia Korčogová helped UCSIA to organize this webinar under supervision of UCSIA project coordinator Barbara Seegaard, who has once more done a wonderful job in organizing this webinar. So thank you, Barbara, Lucia, and Peter. Peter, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Dr. Stijn Latré. Thank you, Stijn. It's a pleasure and honor to moderate this UCSIA online webinar on environmental mobility and solidarity. So the presumption that we will be working under today is that we see climate change and its consequences on the environment as well as human beings. Yet, really, can we see this? And if so, is there a link between climate change and mobility? Isn't climate change a little bit too slowly moving for our eyes and for our actions? True, we do see urgency, for example, in disaster displacement. Yet, is that linked to climate change? What is the scientific evidence? We also see activists and their actions, especially the youth they teach us. Yet, can they help us with recognizing the complex causal mechanisms? And is there a link to solidarity, at least a moral one? And if so, how should solidarity be organized? As climate justice, the welcome of refugees, legal action? And if solidarity is the answer, by whom should it be organized? Governance and governments, civil society, the academia, religious organizations? To put things into perspective, what we clearly see are people displaced in the context of climate change and environmental disasters. We see internal displacement mostly within countries and some border crossings where then refugee law enters, even if such people do not qualify as refugees, because it's very difficult to show that climate change amounts to persecution. While there is no such thing as a climate refugee, there are people whose circumstances have been made worse because of climate change. Displacement, conflict, and disasters are often interlinked. If I, after Stijn, may quote Pope Francis in Laudato Si, everything is linked. These and many other questions will be addressed today. So as we gather this afternoon as a community of scientists and social activists and climate action advocates, and perhaps bureaucrats, politicians, global citizens, maybe even people of hope and faith, we are interested in learning more about the dynamics of interconnected systemic injustice and solidarity. We are interested in engaging in our personal and collective responsibility to tackle the ecological crisis. And we are interested in empirical evidence on what environmental mobility and adaptation to climate change looks like. We will hear a number of examples for their environmental migration from Morocco to Belgium and immobility in Morocco. We will hear about the religious perspective. And at every presentation, I will introduce the speakers. Before I give the word to speakers, let me just repeat very briefly what Stijn has shared with us with house rules. So should you have a question, please do not hesitate to put it in the Q&A function, or send it to me privately or publicly in a chat if that works better for you. Or if you want to address it, do, and I will give you the floor. And you're very much welcome to be open your heart and mind so that the questions or comments that arise in you can be shared with others. We are a community that would like to learn from one another and digest well what we will receive from an excellent group of speakers today. So we are all encouraged to interact. Our first speaker today is Josianne Gauthier. She is the Secretary General of CIDSE, which is short for Coopération Internationale pour le Développement et la Solidarité, which is an international family of Catholic social justice organizations working for what they call transformational change to end poverty and inequalities, challenging systemic injustice, inequity, destruction of nature, and promoting just and environmentally sustainable alternatives. I quoted that. What a mission. CIDSE. Josianne has been with CIDSE since 2017. Originally a Canadian, a lawyer, with she has a long experience, over 20 years, in international development and solidarity. She focuses on human rights. It's a great privilege to have Josianne with us. It's been also a privilege to me to work with Josianne in the past as we together established the European Laudato Si Alliance. Also, Josianne and CIDSE has hosted a number of ELP fellows in the past, and they continue to do so, which is a pleasure. Not to mention that Josianne is a friend and colleague. Her contribution today is entitled From Truth to Solidarity, with the subtitle, The Painful and uncomfortable questions we must ask ourselves if we want to build a world of justice. What a compelling title, forcing us to open ourselves to vulnerability, because it seems that she will talk about pain and discomfort as we are trying to engage in this discussion, moreover, in action. Josianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure to be here as well, and I will offer my reflections with a lot of humility because I don't pretend to have answers, but these are questions that we are struggling with at CITSE, so I'm happy to share them with you if this helps in our collective journey, essentially, to find better truth, which could lead to justice and solidarity. So I see it more as a process that we're all on, rather than an A to Z, template of action. But I'm happy to share our experiences as CITSE, and I will share a PowerPoint, which I will attempt to do immediately. Can you see it? Yes? Okay. Do you only see the PowerPoint, or is there business? No? It's okay? All right. Excellent. So one thing that I have noticed in the past year or two, especially, I think since I had the honor of participating in the Synod on the Amazon in Rome, but also before that in my work in Canada, working on peace and reconciliation and truth and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of Canada in a very modest way, is that the listening and the seeing part of this trilogy, of the CJJAC, is one that we tend to skip over a little bit fast, especially the listening part. And how we see the world around us and how we listen to the signals around us is so important because it frames everything afterwards. And the first question we've been asking ourselves at CITSE and within a broader community is, how are we listening? What are we listening to and who are we listening to when we look at the world around us? Because when we look, and we heard this in the introduction, it's sometimes very distressing to see and to hear certain things in our environment, in our world around us. So maybe things we would rather not see or hear. But it's actually very important to face those truths and those uncomfortable truths, as we said. We know that there's multiple crises right now. This is our context that we're in. We're in a climate ecological crisis. We know this. We've got, the IPCC reports are clear. We have about 10 years to get this business done, to turn things around before irreparable damage and irreversible trends take root. There's still time, but we really have to act. We know we're in a social justice and inequality crisis, whether it's from an economic perspective or the effect of the pandemic, the uneven distribution of the issues related to the pandemic, the consequences that we've seen. Although everybody was subject to the pandemic, not everybody suffered in the same way or was protected in the same way from its consequences. And then there's the democratic and human dignity crisis, I call it, which is what we usually call the political crises. And these are the interconnected crises of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor that we know of in Laudato Si. We saw that during, and especially in the past year and a half, that democracy didn't exactly advance under the pandemic, that there were situations where actually abuse of human rights increased under the guise of governments taking control of the situation. So there was decreasing and continued to be decreasing space for human rights and civil society and democratic expression in a lot of places. And this is also part of the mobility crisis and the migration crisis. Now, I'm not an expert on that, and I very much look forward to hearing this from the people who will follow. But I'm just setting it in the scene because these are all interconnected crises as we understand it. Why? Because we're living beyond our planetary boundaries. We're living beyond the capacity of the planet. And that is both in terms of resources, but also in terms of relationships and the way we treat each other. We have busted all of the boxes. We are not living sustainably, neither in our relationships towards people or towards Earth. And this is the root cause, in our reading, in our experience, this is the root cause of all of these crises. So it's not so much about causal links between crises as common roots to the multiple crises. We have seen our vulnerability and our fragility. And not just, as we said, those who are poorer or who are more exposed to violence or to aggression or to climate change, but in the wealthier countries, we saw how dependent we are on the most vulnerable to keep up our style of life, our comforts, suddenly all of these people who we didn't value essentially in society or in other countries were the ones that we were the most dependent on, whether it's people working in the fields, whether it was people caring for the elderly or caring for children, people at the lowest paid possible income. These were the people we were most dependent on during the crisis, and that had to keep going and keep working and keep supporting the rest of us. So it really exposed an unequal and an uneven situation that we are all part of, and therefore our own vulnerability. We know that we live in a system that right now, an economic system of extractivism, as Pope Francis calls it as well, where we basically extract resources from the earth and talent from people, or their wealth and their talents and their gifts, and then we throw them away once we've consumed them. So it's a very consumerist approach to our relationships, and this is part of the critical underlying connecting issue between these crises. So as I mentioned, these crises are all interconnected, and you see these little arrows, and that's because I have limited skills in graphics. But basically, these arrows should be going in all directions, right? Because the systemic injustice is also feeding back into a loop and reinforcing the ecological crisis and the social economic crisis and the political democratic crisis and human rights crisis. It's all, feeding into itself. And so it's not just one directional in any way. The impact is also intergenerational. And this is an important point we need to raise. And the Pope has raised it recently as part of how we're going to get out of this cycle. We have to remember, and here I'm going to draw on the wisdom of the Indigenous people from where I'm born in Canada. So the Iroquois Nation, which is really the land that where I was born in Quebec province, have a principle of 7 generations. And this principle is often spoken about now in ecological justice discussions, which is the principle that whatever decisions you make today will have an impact on 7 generations to come. So you have to think in terms of the future, but it's also a principle that applies to the present, meaning that the present situation you're in is the impact of 7 generations ago of decisions that were made before you. And so you're always with one foot in the past and one foot in the future, which is counterculture to a lot of the politics we see and a lot of the decisions that get made, which is extremely not only temporal in the present, but almost immediate and instantaneous. So we have disconnected from the past and future in making decisions. And this is a principle of justice. We have to think that we don't own these decisions. They are other people's lives. And so this is also a principle that should be guiding us in our reflections. We know that the response is going to have to be radical, and Peter said painful maybe, and I think it depends on how we see pain, but I have 3 children, so I know something about pain, and it's leading to something quite beautiful, but you have to accept that that's part of the path, that you have to face some discomfort to find something true and living outside of it. And so it's not about martyrdom, but it's about recognizing how important it is to go through the process and face the discomfort and face the truth of the situation we're in. And we're going to have to change, and we're going to have to be extremely radical and transformative in our approach, because continuing on this path, we know, is simply not possible. So we don't really have a choice. So we may as well embrace it and lead this reflection instead of succumbing to it too late. I'm gonna share some very honest sort of perspectives of what have we done about this as CITSE. And I'm going to take CITSE because I can speak about CITSE with a critical perspective, and I'm not judging anybody because it's my own family. So I'm going to use us as an example of how even with the best of intentions, we can sometimes fall short. And this maybe can be taken, to broader spaces, and other people can take lessons from this. But what have we done in response to this world that we saw around us? How have we tried to respond? So most of our members, and CITSE as a collective, has done a lot of advocacy work for social justice, for human rights, for ecological justice, for fair food systems, and promoting sustainable lifestyles. A lot of our members have also worked on migration issues and the rights of migrants and trying to adjust the laws in the countries of Europe where they are. We've gone to the COPs to try to get engagement and participation. On the other hand, a lot of our members do a lot of support work, a lot of international aid and solidarity work, some emergency support as well, and a lot of educating and mobilizing in their own country to raise awareness. The problem is that often these actions fall very much short of the actual urgency of the crisis. So they're just a little bit under, and it's extremely frustrating for people of goodwill who really have the heart in the right place, but they sense the frustration. Why? Because the actions are often isolated from one another. They're not interconnected the way the problems are interconnected. We're talking about the same people. At the end of the day, it's the same community that's being affected by all of these issues. And here we are coming at them separately, differently, inefficiently in some cases, despite our good intentions, often not harmonized because of funding, the architecture of aid, because of different donors and their different requirements, because of those limitations and the way we have to measure the progress of the project. So then it becomes very projectized, and that can be a limit to interconnected and systemic approach and response, and also to transformation. The same with advocacy. We have to deal with so many different audiences. How many times have we had to go to many different desks at the Commission to speak to different people when we're talking about the same community, and that can be extremely exhausting. And it's so there is there are things that we can do better, surely, and we have to think about that, but we have to have a bit of courage because it's not going to be easy. What is the transformation, the radical transformation we're looking for? It was mentioned that we have to ask some uncomfortable questions. So I'm going to share some of the uncomfortable questions we've been asking ourselves in our own reflections, in our own discussions at CITSE. And one of them is, how have we become accustomed to the unacceptable? How is it that whether it's in migration issues or in climate change issues, we have somehow internalized it or normalized death at sea, repression in detention centers, global warming, disappearance of some, loss of biodiversity, unhealthy food systems. How have we internalized and normalized this? And how have we accepted somehow that this violence to us and to our planet is somehow the norm and something we can't do anything about? How did that happen? We really need to revisit that. The other truth or uncomfortable question is, where does my comfort and quality of life or my privilege come from? At what price? Who's paying for that? I'm not. Who made sure that I have a warm house to live in? How is it that I have fruits and vegetables all year long? How is this possible? How is it possible that because I happened to be born in one country, my life is good, and in somebody else's world, life is not so easy? This inequality, this injustice, which is in the system, where does it come from? And how do we tackle it? What are the blockers and the lock-ins to this change? Is it our fear of losing that privilege and that comfort? So unless we start to ask these uncomfortable questions, and whether it's about racism or whether it's about gender inequality or whether it's about the colonial patterns of our history, of our relationships, we can't act in authentic solidarity if we don't address those root cause questions. And without addressing those questions, we cannot reconcile. We cannot heal together. And we certainly can't renew our relationships. So our reflections have brought us to this point, where we're thinking, in order to have true solidarity and transformation, as it's expressed in Fratelli Tutti, we have to really change our hearts and see the other and see the creation around us as part of us, because that seems to be the only way that we're actually going to care enough about this life as much as ours, and that we see them as interconnected, and that we see our interdependence on each other, and that we need each other. It's about our common life, our common home, as we've put it. And we've used that expression so much, but it is so powerful. It is so powerful. And in a family, not everybody has the same role to play, but we do owe each other respect and responsibility. And this means sharing power. It means sharing space. And as I said, recognizing that we need each other. And it means hoping, because one of the things that is a lock-in to change and transformation is when people stop hoping, when they think that it's not possible, when they believe this untruth, that there's nothing we can do about it, that there's nothing we can change, and that it's not my job to do anything about it. This is an untruth, and we need to replace that with hope and faith and action, because hope is actually an active verb in my vocabulary. And so it has to be something that is exercised and practiced as a muscle, in a sense, you know. And also the act of action, or the gesture of acting, gives us hope in return. So again, we have a helpful cycle of building our hope and our faith by acting in solidarity together. And it also gives us strength, because then we know that we have each other and that we're not all isolated in our actions. So with this, I will stop and I will welcome any questions later on. And it's been a pleasure being with you to help open this webinar.
How about now? Josianne spoke about the need to see and listen so that we can watch and hear, right? Thank you very much, Josianne, for your presentation. A very compelling presentation. And I would suggest that we, as attendees of this webinar, take now a few moments in silence, just to take down a few notes about things that moved me, that moved you, that moved me in a sense that Josianne was presenting on a number of issues that are connected to justice and pain and care and our common home and hope and more and more. What moved me? And let us take this time just to cherish what happened in me as I listened to Josianne's presentation, and also to pin down a few words or thoughts or even questions for the debate later. But first, let me be a bit selfish and just take the fruits myself from Josianne's presentation. What do I really benefit from this presentation? 60 seconds, no more. This is really privileged time for you. All right, thanks again, Josianne, and thank you all for listening to yourself. Our next speaker is Laura van Praag. She is the director of the Center for Migration and Intercultural Studies at the University of Antwerp. She has a PhD in sociology from Ghent University, and her research interests are ethnicity, gender, climate change, environmental change, migration, and education. The Center, CEMIS, is co-organizing this event, and it's a pleasure for us to be with the Center and be with the director of the Center. The Center was founded in 2005 at the University of Antwerp on the initiative of a group of researchers who were working together within the framework of the Antwerp Center for Migrant Studies. This was an interdisciplinary and open platform for researchers, policymakers, and other members of the society. Very interesting. And this center continues to build on existing research tradition within the university regarding migration and intercultural studies. So Laura's presentation is entitled A Qualitative Study of the Migration-Adaptation Nexus to Deal with Environmental Change in Tinghir and Tangier, speaking of Morocco. So we are very much interested in your presentation, Laura, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Let me know if you don't hear me. I had some microphone issues. And also thanks a lot at everyone at UCSIA for organizing this event. It's very nice, and it challenges also my research and the way we look at environmental migration. So today I'd like to, yes, I'd like to start with some empirical study indeed on in Morocco on how people themselves perceive the so-called migration-adaptation nexus, and I'll explain it slightly more and to reflect a little bit on how solidarity could be organized. So over the years, both migration and environmental change have been put highly on the agenda. But the ways they have been linked to each other has changed over the years. So initially, well, it's a relatively new phenomenon, not that it is new, but that it's on the agenda. But in the 90s, there was this first constatation that environmental migration could lead to mass displacement. And these climate migration or environmental migration was seen as a global security threat, actually. So it was presented in such a way that it alarmed also people to do something about climate change, but also to do something about migration policies. In these discourses, environmental change was seen as a push factor for migration, and it was often also seen very bluntly like, okay, it will be a cause for migration without necessarily linking it to the other changes within society or how societies are actually organized. So, which could also be a reason for migration. So how environmental change corresponds and relates to political, economic, and social changes in a society, and how in the end it could lead to migration. So I just showed you one pic which if you Google climate migration or environmental migration, you see often many people on the run, and or they, I'm not sure even whether people are on the run always in all those pics, but at least it shows masses of people, which often is meant in an alarming way. Over the years, it changed a little bit, or new approaches came. Because in this first global approach, environmental change was perceived as a threat or a challenge for global security. And on the way, some actors have put to the fore a different view. Migration could be used actually as an adaptation strategy to deal with environmental changes. And this is interesting because it uses actually the same terminology as the IPCC reports that make a distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And migration in that sense is also seen as a part of adaptation, and which could be seen as a successful way to deal with environmental change. So in this framework, it's more related to other factors that could lead to migration. And they try to have a more holistic approach to consider all vulnerabilities in both social and biological systems, and how they're affected by environmental change, but also how they could lead to migration. So it's already considering a far more factors. And in this strategy, or in this approach, the proponents actually suggest that migration is a potential strategy to reduce demographic pressures, to share knowledge within migration networks, migrant networks, and it should be seen as one adaptation strategy next to others. So it's not seen as something bad. It's more like, yeah, you know that maybe many people locate themselves near at the sea level in huge cities where they're actually more prone for sea level rise, for instance. So that makes them actually additionally vulnerable. So by governing this migration, you could actually you could actually cope better with this climate change. There was a lot of critique, or gradually there became also critique, because it was very interesting for policymakers to frame it as such. However, it puts a lot of pressure on the people themselves. People should know a lot about migration. They should know on how it should be organized. They should know a lot about climate change. It puts a lot of pressure on that people support their relatives. And what about those who do not have any migrant networks? And it also ignores structural approaches to deal with climate change. So in my study, and I'll just give a brief view, I asked people living in Tinghir and Tangier in Morocco, both regions in a different way affected by climate change, how they see this relationship. And in both regions, there was a lot of migration to Belgium and other European countries, because it's a nice approach, but if people who have migration aspirations do not perceive it as such, they also do not, for instance, use their remittances to deal with these climate changes, or they don't see their migration trajectory as an adaptation strategy. This is part, the data was collected as part of the Migration-Adaptation project. Please Google it a little bit more, where also other fieldwork was conducted in Senegal and Congo. And my fieldwork was based on 2 regions, and I conducted 48 interviews in Morocco. So in Tangier it's a growing industrial city that attracts a lot of internal migrants, but there's also a lot of transit migration. While Tinghir, there is a lot of migration since after the Second World War, and it has continued. So there is a culture of migration, and it continues. So there are many people who know people who have migrated. Everyone has a sister, or almost everyone actually. And it used to be like this oasis where people used to go because it was good for doing agriculture. So the main results, I'm already giving away everything, but the consequences of both migration and environmental change were more pronounced in Tinghir. Like it's a mountain area where if you rely a lot on agriculture, you feel also a lot more these environmental changes. Migration had a different impact on the adaptive capacity of all inhabitants in both regions, and also impacted the population differently. So depending, let's say, on your profession, gender, and the location of your house, etc., you were affected in a different way, because in Morocco, you also had a lot of slow onset environmental changes, which means that it's, as already mentioned, it's hard to perceive yourself, as it doesn't give rise immediately to disasters. So you saw that there were already a lot of migrant networks, and in this migration as an adaptation strategy discourse, they say that the use of remittances is often used as an argument that people could help in the region of origin to facilitate climate adaptation. However, if you look at how people use these remittances, and it is also quite understandable, they use it actually not necessarily to deal with climate change, but they use it to cope with their daily challenges and to improve their standards of living, for instance, by investing in education, transport, health, etc. So so people send it from family to family. They often also try to send, so migrant networks try to invest also in the region of origin in projects. So there was a lot of solidarity in that sense. However, it's not necessarily always related to climate change, and it's not always coordinated with all other projects, of course, because it's really bottom up. in the region of Tinghir more. So as Zakaria says, they just send money just to live, to pay the rent, light, water, clothes, or shoes. But actually, I saw also that they also invest slightly more in community projects. But the idea is that it's not coordinated and it's not necessarily linked to climate change. So sometimes if you look at it, it's related to water, or sometimes to agricultural activities, but certainly not always. So sometimes, in some cases, people are still investing in agriculture, and when they receive remittances, they do invest it in ways to deal with these environmental changes. However, it doesn't necessarily benefit the entire community. Let's say if you have a water pump in one place, it could also affect the water of your neighbors. So also that is not always coordinated. So it's not like a structural adaptation of the community. And you also see that since there is a lot of migration, the initial migration motivation changed along the way. So it became often perceived as an economic motivation. For instance, as Hasna said, there was no work. She refers to, there's only agriculture. And since it's in a degrading environment, it's not always seen as interesting to invest in. So they leave it aside. There is a lot of tradition on how to deal with water scarcity. As Wadil says, Muslims know how to live like that. However, there's a changing standards of living, which also means that people do not necessarily want to live like their grandparents and their parents. In Tinghir, we saw that there were more adaptation strategies that were applied, and actually many of the remittances were used to disconnect the challenges they faced due to environmental changes, such as degrading environment, desertification. They used those remittances to disconnect the income of people to this environmental change, which makes them less vulnerable for environmental change. So if you invest in a different profession, you don't have to rely on agriculture, for instance. So as Shafiq says, now many people leave the palm grove abandoned because it doesn't provide anything, because there's no water. So people just search for other challenges, working in factories, going somewhere else, learning different professions, instead of, as these climate adaptation proposes, to invest in agriculture, but do it in a different way. Also, they mentioned migration as a possible solution to deal with environmental changes. So there are some people who try to adapt, and with an idea on their own, they make an effort. Agriculture, because we do not have great fields, it's just a small field, and that helps economically to live and to survive only. So it's not a business agriculture in that region, of course, just to live and eat and etc., etc. So some people do not wish to invest in this agriculture anymore, and they try to move to other places where there are more opportunities. However, if you look at the community level, you see that if there were some projects, some bottom-up initiatives or big investments project that actually used remittances in a more coordinated way. So it is possible, it was just not always well coordinated. So they also try to consider the local trends and tendencies, such as a devaluation of agriculture and land degradation, the monetary knowledge flows that shape Moroccan life. So you see that at the community level, if you have a clear view on climate change and migration and the other changes in the society, then you could set up a more community-based project. However, it's very much it relies very much on the knowledge available, the input, and it's still not supported from top down or governmental initiatives. Also not, for instance, from immigrant countries that send a lot of remittances. So it's more a group of people that put their hands on it and say, okay, let's go for this. And migration is seen as a part of it, or it's seen as a way to prevent migration, but they do use their migration. So finally, if you rely too much, I think, well, that's my conclusion, on these migration flows and remittances to set up solidarity to deal with climate adaptation or climate change, it's also very vulnerable, because you have to rely on people who also have already, might have already some vulnerable positions in the immigrant country just due to their migration history. However, if it's more structured, it has some potential to better coordinate and consider the context. However, you should always bear in mind that not the entire community has access to migrant networks. It's not all communities that have the same extent of immigration flows. And if there are some community approaches in the Moroccan context, for instance, you saw that there was that it was often inspired by some religious solidarity at specific moments, and it inspired people to set up these community-based climate adaptation and consider, in a way, migration. However, in this slow onset environment, it's not always so clearly visible what the link is here. So that should be considered when thinking of this migration as adaptation strategy in a solidarity approach. So this is based on a paper. You can always download it. It's open access, and you can always enroll for the Microdapt newsletter. And thanks for listening. I'll give now the floor back. I'll stop share. Yes.
Thank you, Laura, very much for this presentation, and also congratulations on the paper and its publication. Again, here I would suggest that we take a few moments in silence just to see what resonated in us as we listened to Laura's presentation. What touched me? What did I benefit most from? Perhaps I have a few thoughts or even questions, and I put them down. I'll write them down first for myself, and then also perhaps for the group, something that I would like to share later in the Q&A session. So let us do so. All right, what a privileged time we had to cherish in ourselves what happened as we listened to Laura. Our next speaker today is coming from the same center. So we have the pleasure to listen to Loubna Ou-Salah. Loubna is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Migration and Intercultural Studies, Department of Sociology. In her research, Loubna is focusing on migration as an adaptation strategy for climate change, something we already heard about a bit. Her presentation is entitled, "You Can't Even Predict the Rain Anymore: The Importance of Environmental Factors in the Migration Biographies of Moroccan Immigrants in Belgium." I think that we will benefit too from Loubna's presentation. And I think too that Loubna herself will benefit from her presentation. As a candidate, I think she needs comments on her presentation and on her work so that her research is then better used and served in the wider academic and policy community. So welcome to everybody to listen to Loubna, and the floor is yours, Loubna.
Thank you for the introduction. I will share my screen. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. I think I don't need to introduce myself, as Peter did it very good. So for this webinar, I would like to present a case study on the importance of environmental factors in the migration biographies of Moroccan immigrants in Belgium. And first of all, there are numerous studies or climate models that forecast that the world will have 200 million to 1 billion so-called climate refugees and climate migrants by 2050. And these models have gained significant currency. However, the multiple relationship between environmental change and migration is extremely difficult to quantify and disentangle, which makes the use of such straightforward predictions very difficult. And also the focus of these models is often on future migration processes and future migration trajectories. So therefore, I thought it would be interesting to focus on how environmental factors already played a role in the migration trajectories of individuals who have already completed a migration process. And also taking a biographical approach, we just will focus on 3 cases of Moroccan first-generation migrants living in Belgium. And already a large and growing body of literature, environmental migration research, has highlighted that environmental change not automatically translates into migration decision-making, but is mediated by economic and political factors. And in addition, some studies portrayed environmental migration as a multi-stage process, which includes both domestic and international migration processes. However, there is little knowledge of the varied roles environmental change can play in the different stages of the migration process. So starting from migration as a multi-stage process, this study has the objective to demonstrate how environmental factors play a role in migration decision-making during life stages and transition moments, how environmental factors become more relevant during a migration trajectory and lifetime, and how environmental factors interact with other migration drivers. So for the theoretical framework, I will not go into the migration and environmental change discourses as policies, as Laura already discussed this. But it is important to mention that migration can be associated with important stages in the life cycle, such as leaving home for an education or marriage, finding or changing employment, rearing a family, and retirement. During these transitions, people change social roles, acquire new rights and duties, and often need additional resources. And also there are several ideas about the periods of transitions and the markers within and between them. And it is also therefore very interesting for me to include these expectations about or around transition in this research, as this may influence the way migration decisions are made. And maybe this could also be the link with solidarity of this webinar. So qualitative research methods were used, or more specific, biographical narrative interviews. And this enabled us to study systematically the long and fragmentary nature of the migration trajectories. And during the data collection, it was important to learn more about underlying or hidden aspects during the migration trajectory. And examples of several questions that were asked to help respondents tell their story was, for example, what memories do you have of your childhood? What memories do you have of your region of origin? What did your daily life look like in your region of origin? What did you stress or worry about? To what extent were you dependent on the nature or environmental factors? Where did you live throughout your life? Why did you move? How did your migration path look like, etc.? And we chose for Moroccan migrants, as a Moroccan case is very interesting, as over the past 30 years, Morocco has undergone various changes in the annual climate cycle that are particularly visible in the precipitation rates, the average temperature levels, and drought periods. Also, Moroccan respondents are Moroccan migrants are in large number present in Belgium. And as the ability of individuals to detect changes in the natural environment is dependent on factors such as livelihood, the understanding of traditional knowledge, local discourses, we also focused on respondents who relied on the agricultural sector for their livelihood, as they then can link it to their own lives. Okay, so the three cases that we will focus on is first the case of Rožič. Rožič is a 40-year-old man who has been living in Belgium for 6 years. He's married, has one child, and he grew up in Settat, that's 200 kilometers northeast of the big city Marrakesh. His family has been growing maize, lentils, and other products all his life. And he himself moved to another big city, Casablanca, in his 20s. Then we have Khadija, and Khadija is a woman of 61 years old. She has been living in Belgium for 5 years. She comes from Nador, that's a Berber language town in the northeast of Morocco, that's located in the Rif Mountains. She has 5 children, 3 of whom already lived in Belgium before she migrated. So this is important because that means that she already had a migration network in Belgium. Her daily activities in the region of origin were mainly caring for their animals and cultivated olives, figs, almonds, etc. And she worked all her life in the agricultural sector in Nador, and she decided to migrate to Belgium after her husband died. And then finally, we have Fatima's case. Fatima is a 40-year-old woman who migrated from the Azro region, that's in the northern part of the Middle Atlas Mountains. She has been living in Belgium for 10 years. And she had to live apart from her husband for almost 12 years and take on all domestic and agricultural tasks. She was mainly busy with growing food and selling it on the market. Meanwhile, her husband was working in surrounding cities for several companies. And together they have 3 children, and her sister-in-law already lived in Belgium. And this is also important because this helped Fatima's husband to migrate to Belgium and have her and their children reunite later. So, okay, we're going to start with Rožič's case. And analyzing Rožič's story, we can see that his motivation to migrate mainly started when he felt it was time to start his own family, which clearly marks a transition in his life. So he said, I wanted to migrate, especially to find work. And then also it was time to start a family. And because I couldn't do it, or I couldn't do anything at my parents' farm anymore. There used to be a lot of work in the countryside, but not anymore. It's really dry and even desert-like near us, which makes it even harder. You notice that directly on the road when you're driving there. So I had to move to the city because of the economic situation in Morocco. I also longed so much for a stable life and I wanted to do everything to have that, but I knew it was not going to happen in Settat. So we can see that before mentioning his migration trajectory, Rožič already stated that he was thinking that it was time to start his own family and that this would not be possible if he continued to live on the plains. So this means that he felt like he was in a life stage in which stability and the creation of a family were expected. So when he made the transition to entering the labor market, he felt a lot of pressure and responsibility to be able to provide for a family. Also being confronted with drought and precipitation patterns made migration more appealing. However, he found it much more difficult to really link this to the natural environment and referred more to the desire to find work and the lack of employment opportunities without really thinking about the underlying reasons. So this actually shows how environmental change is more a hidden narrative in Rožič's story, which is rather seen as an economic difficulty. So when going through his transition to entering the labor market as a precondition to start a family, this made Rožič more aware of other factors that complicated this transition or to finish this transition. So later, however, when he was discussing his migration path to Belgium, he only refers to marriage and family reunification as the main driver of migration. He says, my aunt already lived here. She had migrated in the 70s because her husband came to work here. She has her children and grandchildren here. I married her daughter myself, and so I ended up in Belgium. They themselves have built up a whole network over the years. So now I also have a large network. So I actually migrated on the basis of family reunification in order to get married. It was quite a process before I could really come over. So we can see that when setting out why he chose to migrate, he does not refer to environmental change or work anymore. Instead, he just links it to the transition to marriage. So therefore, we can conclude from Rashid's biography that environmental factors were mentioned when referring to his transition to the labor market, while these factors were hardly mentioned when discussing his transition to marriage. Which demonstrates the importance to really dissect people's life transition and discuss the importance of environmental factors per transition. Okay, so next we have Khadija's case. And for Khadija, migration was something that took place in a later stage of her life. At the age of 56 years old, she migrated to Belgium after 3 of her children already migrated or were residing in Belgium. So she says, I wasn't thinking about migration. If you don't have money or a network, you can't even think about migrating, no matter how difficult it was. I never thought about moving. My husband had inherited as well, so it all has a different value. He always saw his father working hard on it, and that was just something we accepted and did not want to change. So Khadija did not really aspire to migrate for most of her life, mainly because it seems unrealistic to her due to her lack of resources, which made her also immobile. She also mentioned that they had already spent many generations, energy and time in their work, so that they couldn't just give it up like that. And she says, however, I think that our generation was more aware of the difficulties involved, which made us involve our children less. So I was thinking about migration for my sons because their future could be different. But for me, no, it wasn't realistic and I had the mosque in my street. So I didn't really wait or fight for it myself. That idea lives especially with young people and they do dangerous things for it. So this quote really shows how Khadija is clearly aware of environmental changes and how this affects how people can secure their livelihood in agriculture. So therefore she felt that it was precisely because of environmental changes and environmental factors and difficulties for the agricultural sector that her sons, who had to make the transition to the labor market, should not stay in Nador. So the transition of her sons actually highlighted certain environmental factors. When she was speaking about why she migrated to Belgium, she says, I migrated to Belgium after the death of my husband. Then I also sold and shared my part of land for the inheritance. I'm also tired of taking care of it, and my children didn't want to leave me alone in Morocco, and they were able to arrange a residence permit for me. And that's how I ended up here. My children especially wanted me to live here because they saw with my husband that the medical sector in Morocco is still very bad. If I get sick, I can call on the hospitals in Belgium. So it was actually only after the death of her husband that she did no longer felt that she had the strength to maintain her farmland, which made her consider to migrate. So she preferred to spend more time with her family who were living in Belgium and really to offer the help with upbringing of her grandchildren. So Khadija's case really shows how transitions can make certain factors stand out more or less. So the transition of her sons who had to make the transition to the labor market highlighted certain environmental factors, while when she went through another transition, namely to widowhood, environmental factors became less important and were no longer mentioned as part of her migration decision-making process. Okay, and so finally we have Fatima's case. And Fatima lived alone in Morocco for a long time without the company of her husband. Her husband was often living elsewhere for his job, as he had to look for extra income after the birth of their first child. So she said, I got married at the age of 18. So I had to grow up quickly. I also have 3 children, and from my first, I was already pregnant after a marriage of 4 months. From the birth of our first child, my husband and I were separated for the biggest part of the year. He always had to look for a job for a few months, for which he stayed in a different city each time. That was difficult, but really necessary because we couldn't make ends meet with what we ourselves earned, mainly through selling fruit and vegetables on the local market to support a child. So Fatima's biography clearly shows how they were dependent on their natural environment for their livelihood, as they derived their main source of income from the sale of their fruit and vegetables. And after they made the transition to parenthood, their livelihood was not secured anymore. And therefore, her husband started to take on several jobs in surrounding cities outside the agricultural sector. When she speaks about why she migrated to Belgium, she says, in the end, he was able to come to Belgium. So she's speaking about her husband through his parents, and that was a relief for our family and gave us hope. There were not that many changes for me, except that we couldn't see each other for a longer period of time. He also looked for a job in Belgium as soon as possible, and that was a big difference in income. This also made it less stressful for me to earn enough by growing food, because I have to have this sold at the market twice a week through my sister's son. That was a lot of pressure that also disappeared. Through my marriage to my husband, I got a visa, and me and our children returned to live with him and my parents-in-law in Antwerp. So Fatima migrated to Belgium under family reunification procedures, but by taking a biographical approach where we examined or studied different transitions, we see that other underlying factors have played a major role. So Fatima's case showed how environmental factors affecting farming made it much more difficult to earn a sufficient living, especially once they had children. And as a result of this transition, her husband started looking for alternative ways to secure their livelihood. And this indirectly influenced the possibilities for her migration trajectory. Okay, so now we can conclude, and I have three main findings. So a first main finding, I think, is that the perceived importance of environmental factors varies during different life transitions. So we saw in the three cases, or the three cases demonstrated how environmental change factors are more a hidden factor that can contribute to tensions which become relevant if one goes through a particular transition and disappears into the background again after such transitions or at a following transition. A second main finding is that people are not always able to really recognize contributing environmental factors, as they do not always remain consistently and strongly present throughout the migration trajectory. So we saw that if environmental factors were less important during the last stage of the migration process, these factors were also less likely to be mentioned when people are asked merely about their process or the international migration itself. So also with these cases, if we only asked or if we only focused why they migrated to Belgium internationally without really taking into account the whole entire biography, family reunification would be the only migration factor that would be mentioned. And finally, if we compare the three cases, we can see how the effects of environmental change or environmental factors on the migration decision-making really varies according to economic activities and roles within the households, but also we can see how gender expectations emerge. Okay, so that was it. I hope it was interesting. If there are questions, feel free to ask them.
Loubna, thank you very much for your presentation. What a privilege. You shared your research data with us, your findings. And again, I would like to invite us to take a few moments just to pin down a few words, sentences, or questions that we might have, that I might have, based on the presentation I heard from Loubna. And let's do it right now. All right, thank you again, Loubna. And now we move to Alberto Ares Mateos, a Jesuit from Spain. We're moving from Belgium to Spain. But you will be interested to know that Alberto not only works in Spain, but has connections in Morocco and elsewhere, where we heard about cases from and so on, and beyond. Alberto has a PhD in international migration and development cooperation. He's the director of the University Institute for Studies and Migration Studies at the Comillas Pontifical University. He's specialized also in social ethics. He has a licentiate in sacred theology at the Boston College and also a degree in economics and business. In the center that he's currently leading, the University Institute of Studies and Migration, which was established in 1994, he works with a number of colleagues, and they try to do research and teaching in this field to respond to the complexity and the political and social transformations produced by migratory events. Alberto is also a friend of mine, a fellow Jesuit. He is on our steering committee for social apostolate for Europe and the Near East. He works in our network also called Josianne Migration, and he's connected to the worldwide network that we have on migratory policy, action, and academic perspectives, and is coming to Brussels, actually, to Belgium in September as the incoming director of JRS Europe. Alberto will be presenting under the title of the Pastoral Orientations on Climate Displaced People. It's a recent development, and we would be very interested and hungry for your words, Alberto. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure. I would like to share my screen. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. I would like to start by thanking UCSIA, the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. A special thanks to Barbara and Lucia for making it possible, and also to you, Peter, of course. Can we ignore the growing phenomenon of environmental refugees, that is, people who are forced to live their lives due to the degradation of their natural inhabitants in order to face the danger and uncertainty of forced displacement? I think, no, we cannot. You can see in the slide some data of the global report on internal displacement of this year. Well, the cry of the bounded humanity help us to recognize that the climate crisis has a human face. You see the whole world, no? The whole picture. The international community has recognized the severity of the climate crisis and has made tremendous efforts to resolve its impact through various agreements. Likewise, the Catholic Church recognizes and appreciates the efforts to establish a legal framework, collect data, and conduct a rigorous analysis of the consequences of the climate crisis, as the one that we present before, as well as the involvement of many civil society actors in addressing this challenge. How can we continue to deal with this great challenge? Pastoral Orientations on Climate Displaced People were released on the 30th of March and have been produced within the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, jointly by the Migrants and Refugees section and by the Integral Ecology sector also. The Migrant and Refugees section creates a new webpage on climate displaced persons, the one that we can see on the screen. The Magisterium of the Catholic Church has previously considered the plight of the internally displaced persons and developed reflection and suggestions regarding their pastoral care. These guidelines focus exclusively on climate displaced persons, those persons or groups of persons who have been forced to leave their place of habitual residence due to the severe climate crisis, highlighted new challenges posed by the current global scenario and suggesting appropriate pastoral responses. The main aim of these guidelines is to provide a set of considerations which may be useful to episcopal conferences, local churches, religious congregations, and Catholic organizations, as well as pastoral workers, and all the Catholic faithful in pastoral planning and development of programs for the assistance of climate displaced persons. The guidelines proposed in the documents are deeply rooted in the reflection and teaching of the Church, as well as her practical experience in responding to the needs of climate displaced persons, displaced both within the borders of their countries of origins and beyond. The pastoral orientations on climate displacement are the result of careful listening to the local churches and numerous religious congregations and Catholic organizations working in the field. Although approved by the Holy Father, they did not claim to espouse the Church teaching on climate crisis and displacement. The guidelines open with a short glossary, which aim to clarify some of the key terms used in the document. This is followed by a general introduction, which explains the purpose of the guidelines and the working methodology adopted. The body of the document is divided into 10 points, as you can see. The first is dedicated to a general overview of the topic in order to clarify the state of the art regarding the link between climate crisis and displacement. The following 9 points focus on particular aspects of the phenomenon, according to the dynamics of challenges and responses. The starting point is the need to promote awareness of the issue, to enable everyone to open their eyes to the reality of the impact of the climate crisis on human existence. Sometimes hastily departures can be avoided by finding alternatives to climate displacement. This is what is the third point is about. If departure is unavoidable, then it's necessary to prepare people for displacement. The fourth point, promote their inclusion and integration within the communities that receive them. The fifth point, exert a positive influence on decision-making processes affecting them. Sixth point, and ensure their pastoral care. Seventh point. The eighth point is devoted to cooperation between all the actors in planning and strategic action on climate displaced persons. The ninth, focus on the promotion of professional training in integral ecology for pastoral agents. The last point emphasizes the need to increase academic research, as the one that we heard before, on the climate crisis and related displacement. The guidelines close with a small chapter dedicated to some practical indications on how to use the document, mainly addressed to local churches and other Catholic actors. As a follow-up initiative, I find the Migrants and Refugees section proposal on the best practices framed in the 10 points of the document very interesting. You can see on the screen just some examples of one of each point. The first one, acknowledging the climate crisis and displaced Nexus, this project of Manos Unidas in Spain. I took it, the first one is not because I'm from Spain, just because it was the first one. In the second point, promoting awareness and outreach. This is one of the Catholic relief services in South Africa. Smart skill for smallholder farmers. The third one, providing alternatives to displacement. This one in Argentina, with Misiones Rurales, Argentina. For one, preparing people for displacement. This one in Niger, in Africa. Maximizing the value of cash for work. Fostering inclusion and integration. This one in Gambia, Ghana, Mali, Niger, and Senegal in Africa. Exercising a positive influence on policy making in UK, here in Europe. The one of extending pastoral care, also in UK, with the Laudato Si animation. Cooperating in strategic planning and action in Senegal, preparing for disaster in Senegal. Promoting professional training in integral ecology. And I would say, well, in the last one, fostering academic research. I would like to present, well, one initiative that we have in our institute in Comillas. In our Institute for Migration, we have 2 chairs and 1 observatory. One of the chair is a chair in natural disasters and climate migration. We started, or we created together with, joining with our own foundation, constitute a privileged environment from which we try to give coherence to studies and research, training and dissemination action in this area. The objective of this chair is to promote research on disasters, systematize and disseminate knowledge, contribute to creating a network of highly qualified and experienced professionals, serves as a platform for data collection and a repository for the exchange of experience and lessons learned from the disasters, and constitute a meeting point between institutions, companies, administration, and research centers in the field of disasters. The different lines of research on which the chair works takes the form of research project, doctoral thesis, publication and reports. In addition, we network with other institutions. Well, the 4 lines of research is mainly migration and climate change, migration and pandemics, vulnerability and anthropogenic forest fires, resilient societies, and disaster. Well, these are 2 of the last research that we just took in this chair. No, one is about pandemic and migration with COVID, and the last one is about fires in Galicia and about prediction. It's a region in the northwest of Spain. Let me just finish to highlight 3 important issues I think. The first of all, it's important to acknowledge that climate crisis is real. Well, it's clear here in our webinar, but also with the orientations and what is happening, because we know that we have different research documents, but we sometimes feel that well, civil society, or I don't know, it's hard to find that climate crisis is real. The second one is we need to acknowledge that there is a strong nexus between climate crisis and displacement. Our colleagues present their studies and research, and we can see what are the links. And the third one is, I think we need to offer an integral response to the challenge of climate crisis and displacement. It's ultimately, in terms of our approach, a pastoral challenge, accompanying our brothers and sisters who are increasingly displaced by climate crisis and other ecological hazards. Is the journey that we are called to become a credible and witnessing church, a caring and inclusive ecclesial community. As we live in a common home, as Laudato Si said, together as a common family, as brothers and sisters, as Fratelli Tutti, no, presents also. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Alberto, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your experience and the one from the dicastery, the Vatican, the Church, as pastoral orientations, suggestions, a set of considerations for the churches and beyond. Let us take again a few moments in silence to see what happened in us as we listened to Alberto. What are the major takeaways that I would like to put down in terms of words, statements, or a question or so? Let us do so now. All right, and thank you again, Alberto. So now we can move towards our panel debate with our questions and hopeful responses or answers or so. I would like to invite our panelists to turn their cameras on, and we will be starting our discussion. Those among the panelists and other attendees are invited to use the Q&A function in the lower part of this Zoom session platform, and you can type them in. Two of them already arrived. And I would like to open this panel right now and addressing the questions to the panelists. And I will simply begin with those that we have received already. I have prepared a number myself, but I would like to give floor first to others. This has been a really interesting set of presentations, and I think they make a lot of sense put together. And let us try to disentangle a few of the elements that we have received this afternoon. So we have two questions from Edith that are addressed to first to Lore and then to Loubna. You can also see them there, but I will just read them quickly through and then ask Lore and Loubna to respond. Thanks, Lore, for your nice presentation. The focus on remittances as a leverage for adaptation to climate change is certainly interesting. Yet, isn't migration in the first place a strategy to escape from the impact of climate change? So, Laura, perhaps the floor to you first.
Yes, thanks, Edith, also for your question. And indeed, I think it is, from a migrant perspective, a strategy to escape from the impact. And why would you actually change? Why would you stay if you think that the livelihoods or the living conditions for you and your family are actually endangered due to climate change? So indeed, I fully agree. But it's interesting how to see how it took a turn and how it's promoted by some policymakers to say, like, okay, let's use actually the remittances and make it profitable in a way to deal with climate change. First of all, because they themselves don't have to invest in climate change adaptation. So it provides opportunities, for instance, by reducing the taxes you have to pay on remittances, because it takes a part of a lot of incomes for some country, like in Morocco. It's a huge amount. So they saw some potential, but I think it's very tricky, because then you just use actually individual money or financial flows to deal with climate adaptation. However, there are some interesting parts there as well. If you know that there are a lot of communities, migrant communities that want to invest or be solidarity from whatever reason, they have to be solidarity with the regions of origin. You could also help or support the streamlining on how to use the money or facilitate it. So that could always be done, but I don't think it's a structural answer. So I think it's also not supported by individuals, as they don't frame it like that. It's the same like if you receive some money from your family for a particular occasion, it's not that you suddenly want to invest in the country. That doesn't necessarily give it back to you, or you will also use it. But it has been used and proposed many times. So I think you see that also the people who migrate are also, it's a very particular group. So even to reduce demographic pressures, if you would see it like that it becomes more livable for the ones who stay, then you see that actually the young males are the first to migrate, followed by young females. And it's not healthy, let's say, demographic situation. So you see particular groups leaving, some groups stay, and it's not balanced. So it doesn't provide like any future anymore, because since many young people want to migrate, who were the ones who will invest in their future there? So actually then the elderly become more dependent on those remittances, on their family members to do something. So I fully agree, and I think there are other solutions necessary to deal with it, climate adaptation, and to frame it differently. It was too rapidly that it has been used, from my opinion. But I think if you look at others, communities or people who want to be solidary, you could learn from this approach that it's not supported by individual people or migrants, that you should incorporate local views, as already been said earlier, to make it work. You should consider local communities. But thanks for the question.
Thank you, Laura. And perhaps among our audience, there are other questions on remittances or Laura's presentation. I actually have one, if I may. So you are pointing to this fact that some of the remittances are more directly related to environmental change. And it's almost as if remittances could be an indicator of the strength of the climate change, then pushing people towards migration, right? So the more, let's say, they support a project that provides cleaner water to the village, the more we could believe that that is a problem caused by climate change. That is one part of the question I have. And perhaps it's an indicator, perhaps it isn't. It would be interesting to measure it that way. The second one is, why should people support their communities through remittances for climate change they're not responsible for? Right? So they're paying for something that their community hasn't most likely caused, yet still they're sending money for it. Isn't there an interesting story of solidarity? It's actually a double solidarity. If you have any thoughts about that, or honor other panelists.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, I'm not proponent of this approach, and I don't think it's really valid in a context. In some works, in some projects, or in some situations, it works. It actually leads to adverse effects. So there, I really think if you want to do it good in some situations, it could work, but under specific conditions. So I really don't think it is a solution without support from the government. Your suggestion to use remittances as an indicator for climate change or the strength thereof, I am not 100%. Well, it is an interesting perspective. I think I didn't approach it like that, but actually which I saw in Morocco, but maybe in other in other situations with other other types of disasters, it's different. But in this particular situation in Morocco, you see that in one village has a lot of migrant networks. They receive more remittances over the years, already 2 generations. So they've done things with it. In the next village, they actually don't have so much network. So it doesn't mean that the strength of climate change is not, that it's a clear indicator of climate change. It's more in this particular region, of course, related to previous migration dynamics, when they could help. And also within the region, not everyone migrated. You see that the ones who are the most vulnerable for climate change are the ones without migrant networks. So I do think it's interesting, but then you should consider the unequal spread of migrant networks. So, and that is not the case. And my colleague who did fieldwork in Senegal also saw huge differences in different communities in how those remittances could actually support each other. And it brings along a chain migration. And then the second question, if I immediately may, is that indeed, why should people be solidary for something which is not their responsibility? And I think when you look at climate mitigation, it's more approach from a global perspective. We should all diminish, blah, 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 etc. And then all countries should implement specific strategies. But if you go to climate adaptation, they take more often a local approach, which can also be local, country level, regional level, not like local at every village separately, but which has, because you have to consider the local context, which is interesting. But indeed, then you are confronted with this thing that those people are not responsible. Also, migrant communities are not responsible for this, or the largest one who are responsible. So actually, by using this governmental or approach or policy approach, you actually put a lot of pressure on particular groups who are not responsible for it. So then you come to the question, I think you mentioned it very nicely in the introduction, who should organize this solidarity? And I think by putting too much effort, too much emphasis on these local communities, you have the risk that they're not responsible and they don't, well, it's also above your head, of course, it goes slow, as you mentioned. How can you translate it in the call for action? So I think it should be supported from a higher level and help local levels also to support it and etc. So they can use local context and knowledge to do so. But there, I think there, like, it is a good question to ask who should organize this solidarity exactly. I don't have an answer to that, but I think by putting too much emphasis on migrant groups, actually you target the wrong groups, because suddenly they have to solve also climate issues. I think it's not in proportion.
Yeah, and these are complex phenomena. Thank you so much, Laura, for this. And perhaps on who should do this, Josianne and Alberto could maybe say a few words. But before we get to them, we have a question for Loubna that also came from Edis, which is, Khadija suggested that environment-driven migration is something for the younger generation. Do you intend to interview young people as well? So it's a question for you.
Okay, thank you. I think that's already a suggestion. Yes, so I first started, or I wanted to start with interviewing individuals who already completed their migration trajectory to really see, like, how did environmental factors already played a role and how can it be included in migration studies. But in the next phase, I will go to Morocco for some next interviews. And there I will apply an intergenerational household or family approach, where I will be focusing on different generations. And in this way, I hope to gain more insight in how migration aspirations also because of environmental changes are passed through generations, and how do different generations perceive environmental changes? Do they perceive it in the same way? If they didn't really work in the agricultural sector, for example, like their parents, but also to know more about motivations behind these parental aspirations, like Khadija, for example, who wants her sons to migrate. From where does it come? Which motivations drive these push to their sons? But yes, I think it's very interesting to include. And I did interviews with younger people as well. So I see already some generational differences, especially how they perceive environmental changes. Younger generation isn't really aware of environmental changes like their like the older generation, because they moved to the cities internal in Morocco at a younger age to go to study or to find a job. So we already see some intergenerational differences, but I think it will be very interesting to really in one household see how different generations influence each other and perceive environmental changes differently. But I'm working on it right now, how I'm going to do it, but that's the idea.
Loubna, very good, and let's hope this goes well for you. I have a suggestion, since you now are perhaps more interested in intergenerational approach, maybe you connect with Josianne. She spoke about it and she has some personal experience from Canada. And it's an important approach we also see from, let's say, the church perspective and so forth. So perhaps the two of you could couple and maybe take it further. It's just a suggestion. And before I give the floor also to Josianne and Alberto, because I have a few questions for them, is Loubna, as well as Laura, you have both presented that the variables affecting migration are several. And it's very hard to pinpoint down just the climate change, even though it's important. And sometimes it's more direct, sometimes it's very indirect. It also depends on the level of transition, on the let's say the different paths people are in, on different life moments, and it would be interesting to see how this evolves and how variables change over time while they're important. And this is to say that because often policy people would like to see us, we want to have concrete results. So there is a very direct relationship, causal relationship, and otherwise we will not fund it. And we see that life is not that simple. Yet to have a perspective, a scientific perspective on this and on the weight of different variables, I think would be very interesting. So thanks so much for that. Josianne, I would like to come back to you. You talked about action. You used verbs like hope and care, and that we need each other for our common home. I would like to ask you, where would you begin or actually continue? It's not that we are at the beginning. We're already somewhere, and Sidze has done work, you have done some work, and you talked about our limitation, your own limitation to systemic approach. But right now, and based on the discussion we had so far, what would be your suggestions?
Thank you, Peter. It's true. I mean, it's not as though nothing is being done. And I really want to emphasize that. I think a lot of people are doing incredible work. And we often tend to dismiss how much of the solidarity work really does happen actually at the local and community level, because it's before anything else, it's the first order of community to recognize that we have to work together to thrive, right? So this is a basic principle of community, and so we have to recognize that in all work that we do, and that it's not somebody coming from the outside that's going to teach anybody else what it is to be a community and what it is to hold each other up and to support each other. So that's one thing. I think on the contrary, often the actions of quote unquote help have actually quashed and silenced natural solidarity circles and initiatives and coping mechanisms. And that's very sad, and that's very indicative of one of the problems of this dynamic of, and I see that there's a question in the chat which I would love to jump on, but about the colonial sort of relationships and the unhealthy relationships
Josianne,
and perspectives. Yeah. So, I mean, if we look at solidarity as an action or hope as an action, it's also a state of being, and it's also a vision of the world. And it's a vision of the world in which we see value and dignity in the other, which is equal to ours. And we see dignity in the life of the other and in the hopes and in the dreams of the other as being of as much value as mine. Therefore, I am willing to act and to put actual, my efforts to hold you up. That's a lot. That's a lot. But people do it every day. They do it in their families. They do it with their friends. They do it with people they love and care about. This is the kind of emotion and feeling we have to transpose into bigger circles and at a political level. We have to care enough about each other that we're going to hold each other up and not crush and exploit and dominate. And that's where the colonialism really comes in, and the economic model of capitalism, which is very, very top down, which is very utilitarian. So you exploit and use for growth and for profit, and that always comes at the cost of someone's life, somebody's quality of life, somebody's dignity, of the resources of the planet. So indeed, I truly believe it's a model that we have to really decompose. We really have to untangle from ourselves. We have to stop believing that this model is equal to freedom and liberty and democracy and peace, because it's not working. It's hurting people, and it has been for centuries. So I think we have to sort of break that myth open and rethink and think really in terms of solidarity and fraternity as the starting point, and recognize each other's dignity. So there's a starting point which is personal, but it's collective as well. So who has to organize it? I think everybody has to be involved. I think that's my short answer. Everybody has to feel involved. Everybody has to feel concerned. And everybody has to find it unacceptable that people feel they have to leave their country. But that's one thing. But on the other hand, they have to feel it's unacceptable to not open the door to them as well. Because by what right or by what story did we tell ourselves that somehow the people on this side deserved the good life and somebody else didn't? That is the fundamental flaw in the logic. And that's something we have to tackle. We have to talk about mentalities. We have to change mindsets.
Thank you, Josianne. You have written on this. You have written on colonialism and decolonization. You have written on synodality, the importance to listen to one another. You talked right now about capitalism. We have to know that the Pope also supports capitalism, but not any capitalism, not wild capitalism. And that's why we talk about the economy of Francesco. And I would just give you an example. So in the United States, businesses that deal with hospitality in terms of ski resorts, they notice that the snow now is going higher and higher. I mean, it's less and less available on lower altitudes, which means that they have to adapt. We talked about adaptation, not just of migrants, but now also of businesses. And because they're oriented towards profit, they have to be. They are now moving to different parts of the United States with those same businesses so that they can provide further ski pleasures. Yet what I see emerging is that in classes of business administration, there is more and more awareness about climate. And professors themselves are challenged to bring that in. And I think it's very important. Yet we need to listen to one another. And professors need to listen to one another, and companies need to listen to people and those that are affected, because, as you said, there is a cost that comes with these kind of if it's only profit, only seeking adventures. And I think that's very important. Alberto, you talked about practices that emerged from a listening process. You talked about perspectives and suggestions that came from listening to people, and then you showed some of the cases. From your point of view, where do you see currently the biggest impact, or you would want to see a desired impact based on the pastoral recommendations that came out from the Vatican?
Thank you, Peter. Well, I think best practices are good to see how are the path that we can follow with these recommendations, and of course with all the things that we have listened today and in our presentations. I would say that probably the main points or the key elements have to deal with some of the elements that Lore and Loubna and Josianne have said just before. I would say we have to see this orientation, first of all, to be implement in our local context, and all these best practices are connected with local communities and with local governments, and some of them were join working groups in different places. I would say that when there is a mix of motivation, of the elements that, for example, Lore and Loubna was saying about Morocco and how can we connect climate crisis with local communities, no, and remittance and everything. I think this experience with best practices also when we see, for example, in Central America. It was in Honduras, just no, and also El Salvador, and with the all the caravanas. Have you heard about this? No, in Central America, Mexico, and the US. I think the orientation, for me, one of the key elements have to be with go to the local authorities and, well, of course, the bishops and the but also to implement like a common approach. Josianne was saying, and I like, we need each other, no, to work on it, because when you, well, when Loubna was saying about all the interviews, and you could get a mix of motivation of the people. Of course, we underline the climate change and whatever, but you see what is family and different backgrounds, the remittance, and so it's really important to have like an integral response on these issues, and we cannot only push to the local communities and the migrants to reverse, because it's what we said before, Peter. It's like if they want to pay twice, of this situation. I think it's something that we have to go from different perspectives and work together. I think for me the orientations at the end, it's like a kind of advocacy program. Well, for local communities, of course, but but to deal with this climate crisis and raising awareness at different levels.
Thank you, Alberto. So these orientations as local and global advocacy as well as action, they come from the Vatican. Yet also Laura mentioned before religious solidarity, and we know from the experience, and Alberto talked about this is not just about the Catholic Church answering these needs. Loubna has presented a number of questions from migrants that are from, let's say, with presumably different religious background, yet we see some solidarity emerging. And perhaps let us finish with a few words on solidarity. I would like to ask our panelists, Laura, Loubna, Josianne, Alberto, to give us a perspective of solidarity, religious or beyond, about climate change induced migration. And I would like to open the floor to you. Perhaps you simply unmute yourself and go. Maybe I give the floor first to our PhD candidate. Loubna, would you go first?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question because it was only when Barbara and Lucia invited me that I was thinking about solidarity and environmental change. But I think it's very interesting, and also for my future research to really include it, because I think that that indeed there are some interesting questions. Also, when I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking, how can I link solidarity with my results? But there was a lot of things that I was thinking about. For example, how, for example, Khadija, because of the question, want her sons to have a better life, and I was thinking, like, is it only for her sons, or also because of what they can give back when they are migrating? How do people think about it? But also, how does religion play a role? Because in my interviews, I saw there were a lot of respondents who were speaking like, I can't predict. If I would ask, how do you think it will be in the coming years? They were like, oh, I can say that because it's in the hands of God. yeah, so they're like it's miktab in the sense of it's all written already. So if there are going to happen disasters, there will be disasters. So it was interesting for me how they are thinking about it. But when I was invited, I was looking for some different research, but I saw that there are a lot of religion perspective of or papers that are written, like how they are motivating people to really think about climate and how important climate is for example, Islam, if we think about a Moroccan case, but also Catholic. And there are a lot of literature already about it. And I think it's something that I wouldn't think about myself to look up, but I think it's for me very interesting because I'm now halfway my PhD, so I can implement it, and I learned a lot, and I will learn a lot by working on this topic. And so yeah, thank you all also.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, don't put everything into your PhD. You know, with your PhD materials that you're now gathering, that will be material for you for 10 next years. But solidarity is important. Thank you so much for this. Laura, your perspective, where does solidarity come into play? How does it work? Your final conclusion in a minute.
Okay, thanks. Well, I agree with Loubna. I think if you read a lot on climate adaptation or climate migration, it's a different discourse of studies, and they don't involve solidarity. But if you look at how people do it themselves, especially religious solidarity, so religions are often a driver to organize solidarity. And I think you only see, or people only approach the effects, but actually how you saw in my case in Morocco that it was often related to some religious events, and that people also looked at it from their own religious views as it's normal, you have to give back. So those things are interesting to consider, but at the same time, if it's not supported by structural approaches, I think there should be an interplay in a way, like I love actually the solidarity which is organized and inspired by religion. But I think governments shouldn't only rely on that, on the goodwill of people. They should help to support it and facilitate it and do more. So this religious solidarity should be a motivation for people to become more aware of climate change. So knowledge sharing, yes. And it could be the cherry on top of the cake, but you shouldn't rely only on that as looking at it from a more developmental or policy or global approach. So at the IPCC, they shouldn't only wait until people tackle it themselves. So I think it, but if you want to implement things, I think you should consider this religious solidarity and also look at religious views on climate change or views in general to implement what you want to achieve, to really do it how you wish. So I think it is certainly important. And I actually am also inspired by this webinar. So I will also look more into it and think about those questions. So thanks a lot.
All right, more data for researchers. Of course, it's a necessary condition, solidarity, also religious solidarity, but not sufficient. So we need a systemic approach, and you mentioned that. Alberto and Josianne, I would give to Alberto a word first. Your thoughts on solidarity, and I have to give you less than a minute.
For me, solidarity has to be with recreate our identity, taking care of our common home. Solidarity has to be with dignity, hospitality. Also, as Lorena was mentioned, promoting inclusive policies from government. We cannot talk about solidarity without a structural change. Have to be with social cohesion also. Solidarity has to be how to deal with diversity in our societies. And of course, at a global level, how to deal with global compact on migration. No? Thank you.
Alberto, and you speak from your experience. In your own community, you receive migrants and they live with you, refugees, and you eat with them and you live with them and you share your space with them. So there is a very concrete example of solidarity. Thank you so much. Josianne, you begin. You opened our panel this afternoon. A concluding word to you.
Yes, thank you. I think there's so much we could say about solidarity, and we've already spent 2 hours talking about it. But to me, it's about responsibility towards one another, towards creation, towards our home that we have the common responsibility to keep and to care for. It's also about intergenerational justice. I think the testimonials that were shared were really interesting about that, thinking about future generations, thinking about our responsibility towards the future. And so our commitment to contribute now. And so I say this, but I don't say it in abstraction of the politicians. I think that this is a feeling and a driver that should be leading all, levels. And that's the issue. Solidarity should be the driver of mitigating or reducing climate injustice and dealing with it as a justice issue. So solidarity because it's an injustice. So joint struggle together, because we believe that we can only get out of this together. There is no going forward if we're not together.
Josianne, thank you. And thank you for your drive and helping us to move on in thought and in action with heart and mind. I would like to thank all the panelists for their contribution today. These will be shared as written materials later through UCSIA. I would like to thank all the participants for the questions and more, and would like to conclude this, I think, really important webinar that we put together, and thank again the team at UCSIA, and especially Lucia, who has put a lot of effort into this, and would conclude it with a word of thanks and hope to more of such events. All the best and bye-bye.